The summer heat pressed against my weathered skin as I stood in the driveway of what everyone called Henley's Folly, the abandoned farmhouse I'd just inherited from my great-uncle Earl. Rusty, my German shepherd mix, sniffed cautiously at the warped porch steps, his ears twitching with that familiar alertness that had served us well through 30 years of partnership. The neighbors had already started their whispered conversations about the broken-down mechanic who thought he'd struck gold with a property that hadn't seen paint in 2 decades. Mrs. Patterson from across the road made sure to mention, loud enough for me to hear, how the county assessor valued the whole mess at barely $15,000. But standing there with Rusty at my side, watching him circle the foundation with unusual interest, I felt something those neighbors couldn't understand. The same intuition that had guided me through decades of diagnosing engine troubles and reading the subtle signs that separated a quick fix from a complete rebuild. My name is Frank Morrison, and at 68, I've learned that life rarely hands you anything without making you work for it first. Growing up in rural Indiana during the late 50s, I was the youngest of 4 boys in a household where my father's calloused hands spoke louder than his words. Dad ran Morrison's Auto Repair on the edge of town, a cramped garage that smelled perpetually of motor oil and hope. He taught me that every machine has a story to tell if you're patient enough to listen, and that the difference between a good mechanic and a great one isn't in the tools you own, but in the respect you show for the mysteries hidden beneath every hood. My mother, God rest her soul, balanced Dad's gruff pragmatism with gentle wisdom, always reminding us boys that family meant more than blood. It meant showing up when showing up was hard. Those early lessons shaped everything I became. The husband who worked double shifts to put my kids through college, the grandfather who still changes oil for neighbors who can't afford shop rates, and the man who learned to trust the quiet signals that Rusty gives me when something's not quite right in our small corner of the world. Meeting Sarah at a church social in 1978 changed the trajectory of my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. She was a teacher's aide, with eyes that saw past my grease-stained fingernails to the dreams I carried for building something lasting. We married the following spring, in a ceremony so modest that the reception was held in the church basement, but Sarah never once complained about the second-hand furniture or the apartment above Henderson's Five and Dime, where we started our life together. When our son Michael arrived 2 years later, followed by daughter Jennifer in 1983, Sarah managed our household budget with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, stretching every dollar I earned at the garage until it covered not just necessities, but small luxuries like birthday cake and Christmas presents. She understood that my work wasn't just about fixing cars, it was about being the person folks could count on when their transportation broke down and their world felt uncertain. The day I surprised her with the down payment for our own house, a modest 2-bedroom ranch on Maple Street, she cried tears of joy, while baby Jennifer gurgled in her arms and 3-year-old Michael traced patterns in the grease under my fingernails. That house became our sanctuary, the place where Sarah's laughter filled rooms I'd painted by hand, and where our children learned that love looks like showing up every day, even when you're tired. The years that followed brought the kind of steady satisfaction that comes from building something worthwhile one day at a time. My little garage expanded into Morrison's complete auto service, employing 2 full-time mechanics and earning a reputation for honest work at fair prices. Sarah advanced from aide to full teacher, spending her evenings grading papers at our kitchen table while I balanced the shop's books, and we both helped Michael and Jennifer with homework that seemed to grow more complex each year. We weren't wealthy by any measure, but we were rich in the ways that mattered. Sunday dinners that stretched late into the afternoon, family vacations to Lake Michigan, where the kids collected stones while Sarah and I watched sunsets paint the sky in colors that reminded us why simple moments matter most. When Rusty came into our lives as a gangly puppy in 1995, he quickly established himself as the unofficial shop mascot and the kids' most devoted playmate. Sarah worried he might be too energetic for family life, but I recognized something special in his alert intelligence and unwavering loyalty. He had the same quality I'd learned to value in both machines and people, reliability combined with an instinct for detecting trouble before it became catastrophic. Those were golden years, filled with the comfortable rhythms of work, family, and community, when the future felt predictable and our roles in the world seemed clearly defined. The first hint that something unusual surrounded Uncle Earl's property came during the estate reading 6 months ago. When the lawyer mentioned that Earl had been paying property taxes on buildings that weren't listed in the county assessor's records. Earl had been the family eccentric, a bachelor who spent his later years collecting antique farm equipment and telling stories about the old days that seemed to grow more elaborate with each telling. The farmhouse sat on 18 acres of pasture land that had been in the family since the 1920s. Originally purchased by my great-grandfather as an investment in what he believed would become prime development property. That investment never materialized, and the land passed from one generation to the next, accumulating taxes and maintenance costs, but little actual use. Earl had lived there sporadically over the decades, using it as a workshop for restoring old tractors and a storage space for the mechanical curiosities he collected at farm auctions throughout the Midwest. When I inherited the property, most relatives seemed relieved that someone else would assume responsibility for what they viewed as Earl's expensive hobby. But Rusty's behavior during our first visit suggested there might be more to discover than a collection of rusted farm implements and a house that needed significant repairs to be habitable again. The morning we returned to begin assessing what needed immediate attention, Rusty exhibited behavior I'd never seen before. While I examined the foundation for structural damage, he became fixated on a section of the barn where the weathered siding didn't quite align with the rest of the structure. His nose worked frantically along the base of the wall, and when I called him away, he returned within minutes to the same spot, pawing at the ground and whining with increasing agitation. The barn itself appeared to be a standard agricultural building from the 1940s, its red paint faded to a rust color that blended with the surrounding fields. But as I studied the structure more carefully, guided by Rusty's persistent interest, I noticed inconsistencies that my trained eye for mechanical systems couldn't ignore. The roofline suggested interior space that didn't match the visible floor area, and the foundation extended several feet beyond what the exterior walls would require. Most curious was a section of concrete that appeared much newer than the rest, poured with modern techniques that seemed out of place for a building that predated the Korean War. When I mentioned these observations to my son Michael, who'd driven out to help with the initial cleanup, he suggested that Earl might have simply made additions over the years without bothering to update county records. But something in Rusty's continuing fixation on that particular wall convinced me that the mystery deserved deeper investigation. Sleep became elusive as questions about the property consumed my thoughts with increasing intensity. Sarah had passed away 3 years earlier after a brief battle with cancer, and the quiet house on Maple Street amplified every doubt and curiosity that daylight hours couldn't resolve. I found myself lying awake, mentally cataloguing the inconsistencies I'd observed and wondering whether my imagination was creating mysteries where none existed. The rational part of my mind argued that Earl had simply been an eccentric old man with unusual hobbies and poor record-keeping habits, but 40 years of mechanical diagnostics had taught me to trust instincts that couldn't be easily explained, especially when those instincts were reinforced by Rusty's behavior. He'd always been uncannily accurate at detecting problems before they became visible, alerting me to failing alternators days before they stopped charging and sensing coolant leaks before they left puddles on garage floors. His reaction to the barn suggested something significant hidden behind that misaligned wall, something that warranted investigation despite the skepticism of family members who viewed the inheritance as more burden than blessing. I began visiting the property daily, ostensibly to plan renovation work, but actually to observe patterns and gather evidence that might support or dismiss my growing suspicions. My attempts to research the property's history through official channels yielded frustratingly incomplete information. The county clerk's office had records dating back to the 1920s purchase, but several decades showed gaps in documentation that suggested files had been lost or deliberately removed. What I could piece together painted a picture of the land, passing through various family members, with minimal development, until Earl took possession in the 1960s. Neighbors who remembered the earlier period offered conflicting accounts of activity on the property, with some recalling periods when Earl seemed to have unexpected visitors and others insisting the place had always been essentially abandoned. Mrs. Henderson, whose family had farmed adjacent land for 50 years, mentioned that Earl sometimes worked in the barn late into the night, which struck her as odd since he'd never shown interest in actual farming. When I casually asked about the barn's construction history, she became evasive, suggesting that Earl had his own way of doing things and that it wasn't her place to speculate about his business. The conversation left me with the distinct impression that long-time neighbors knew more about the property than they were willing to discuss, and that Earl's eccentricity might have been a carefully constructed facade designed to discourage curious questions about his activities and possessions. The breakthrough came during a systematic examination of the barn's interior, where Rusty's persistent focus on the misaligned wall led me to discover that what appeared to be solid construction was actually a cleverly concealed entrance. Running my hands along the weathered boards, I found a section that moved slightly under pressure, revealing hinges that had been painted over multiple times to match the surrounding wood. Behind this hidden door lay a workshop that took my breath away, a climate-controlled space filled with vintage automobiles in various stages of restoration, along with enough spare parts and specialized tools to stock a professional restoration facility. But more intriguing than the cars themselves were the meticulously organized records Earl had maintained, documenting the provenance and restoration progress of each vehicle with the precision of a museum curator. The collection included a 1967 Shelby Cobra, a 1970 Plymouth Cuda, and several other muscle cars that I recognized as extremely valuable examples of American automotive history. Each car had its own file containing purchase documentation, authentication certificates, and detailed photographs chronicling the restoration process. What struck me as I examined these records was the realization that Earl hadn't been the eccentric junk collector that family members believed him to be, but rather a serious automotive historian who'd assembled a collection worth several $1 million while maintaining the fiction that he was simply a harmless old man with too much time and too little sense. The magnitude of the discovery forced me to confront questions that extended far beyond the monetary value of Earl's hidden collection. Why had he gone to such elaborate lengths to conceal his activities from family and neighbors? How had he acquired the expertise and resources necessary to authenticate and restore such valuable vehicles? And most importantly, what legal and ethical obligations did I now face as the inheritor of assets that had been deliberately hidden from public knowledge? My first call was to Tom Bradley, a lawyer I'd known since high school, who specialized in estate and property law. Tom's initial reaction was skepticism that quickly transformed into amazement as I described the hidden workshop and provided photographs of the vehicles and documentation. He advised me to secure the collection immediately and avoid discussing the discovery with anyone until we could research the legal implications and establish clear title to the assets. The next week involved careful documentation of every item in the workshop, with Tom bringing in an automotive appraiser who confirmed that the collection's value exceeded $3 million and that all documentation appeared legitimate. But the appraiser also noted several irregularities in the purchase histories that suggested Earl might have acquired some vehicles through channels that weren't entirely conventional, raising questions about whether the inheritance would be as straightforward as initially hoped. The legal complexities surrounding the collection soon revealed themselves as more intricate than anyone had anticipated. Tom's research uncovered liens and insurance claims dating back decades, along with disputes over ownership that had never been fully resolved. The 1967 Shelby Cobra, for instance, had been reported stolen in California 40 years earlier, though Earl's documentation suggested he'd purchased it legitimately from a dealer who claimed clear title. Similar complications surrounded several other vehicles, creating a legal maze that would require months to navigate and potentially leave me responsible for returning assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to their rightful owners. But the most significant revelation came when Tom discovered that Earl had been quietly working with federal authorities for over 20 years, using his reputation as an eccentric collector to help recover stolen vehicles and return them to their owners. The hidden workshop wasn't just a private collection, it was part of an ongoing investigation into a network of automotive theft and fraud that stretched across multiple states. Earl's meticulous records included coded notations that helped authorities track the movement of stolen vehicles and identify the individuals responsible for their theft. His death had interrupted this work, leaving law enforcement agencies scrambling to protect ongoing investigations while ensuring that legitimate owners could reclaim their property. The moment of truth arrived when FBI agent Patricia Wolfe contacted me to explain Earl's role in their investigation and request my cooperation in completing his work. She revealed that Earl had been instrumental in recovering over 50 stolen vehicles during his 2 decades as an informant, using his cover as a harmless collector to infiltrate networks of thieves and fraudulent dealers. The workshop had served as a secure location where recovered vehicles could be authenticated and prepared for return to their owners, with Earl's mechanical expertise ensuring that each car was restored to its original condition before being released. Agent Wolf's request was straightforward. Would I allow the investigation to continue using the workshop as a staging area, and would I consider maintaining Earl's cover story to protect ongoing operations? The decision required careful consideration of the risks and responsibilities involved, but ultimately, I recognized that Earl had entrusted me with more than just property. He'd passed along a mission that had defined the final decades of his life. Rusty seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, remaining unusually still as Agent Wolf explained the scope of the investigation and the importance of maintaining operational security. By the time she finished her presentation, I understood that the inheritance I'd received wasn't just valuable assets, but the opportunity to honor Earl's legacy by helping return stolen property to families who'd been waiting decades for resolution. The months that followed transformed my quiet retirement into an adventure that challenged every assumption I'd held about family, justice, and the hidden complexities of seemingly simple situations. Working alongside federal agents and insurance investigators, I helped process the return of vehicles to owners who'd long ago given up hope of seeing their prized possessions again. Each case brought its own emotional rewards, from the widow who recovered her late husband's restored Mustang to the elderly man who was reunited with the Corvette he'd purchased new in 1969 and had stolen from his driveway 3 decades later. The process required learning new skills in documentation and authentication, but it also drew on everything Earl had taught me about reading the subtle signs that distinguish original parts from reproductions and authentic restorations from clever forgeries. Rusty adapted to our new routine with characteristic grace, seeming to understand that our work served a purpose beyond personal gain. He developed an uncanny ability to sense when visitors to the workshop were legitimate law enforcement personnel versus individuals whose interest in the collection might be less honorable. His presence provided both security and comfort during tense negotiations and difficult conversations, reminding me that loyalty and integrity matter more than monetary considerations. The culmination of our work came when the investigation successfully identified and prosecuted the network of thieves and fraudulent dealers responsible for decades of automotive crime. The trial received national attention, not only because of the scope of the criminal enterprise, but also because of Earl's posthumous role in bringing the perpetrators to justice. His careful documentation and patient undercover work had provided prosecutors with evidence that resulted in convictions and prison sentences for 15 individuals, along with the recovery of assets worth over $20 million. The courtroom testimony revealed the full extent of Earl's dedication to this cause, including personal risks he'd taken to gather evidence and his sacrifice of normal family relationships to maintain his cover identity. Sitting in the gallery during the sentencing hearing, I finally understood why Earl had seemed distant and eccentric to relatives who never suspected his true activities. He'd chosen to be misunderstood by family rather than compromise an investigation that could help dozens of victims recover property they'd lost to criminals who operated with impunity for too many years. The judge's commendation of Earl's service provided a measure of closure, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that his work had prevented future crimes and restored faith in justice for families who'd been waiting far too long for resolution. As the legal proceedings concluded and the workshop transitioned from active investigation site back to private property, I faced decisions about the collection's remaining vehicles and the future of Earl's legacy. Several cars had been definitively proven as legitimately owned by Earl, including the carefully restored tractors and farm equipment that had provided his cover story for decades. Agent Wolf suggested that I consider donating some items to automotive museums where they could be properly displayed and preserved, while keeping others as a private collection that honored Earl's memory and expertise. The financial value of the legitimate assets was substantial enough to secure my grandchildren's college educations and provide comfortable security for my remaining years, but more importantly, the inheritance had given me purpose and connection to something larger than my individual concerns. I established the Earl Morrison Foundation for Automotive Heritage, using proceeds from the collection to support law enforcement training programs and victim assistance initiatives. The foundation's work ensures that Earl's commitment to justice continues beyond his lifetime, while also preserving the mechanical knowledge and restoration techniques he'd spent decades perfecting. Rusty, now showing his age but still alert to the subtle signs that guide our daily decisions, seems content with our transformed circumstances, spending his days supervising foundation activities and maintaining his role as my most trusted advisor. The transformation of the abandoned farmhouse from community joke to celebrated heritage site reflects broader changes in how neighbors and family members now view both Earl's legacy and my own role in preserving it. The property that once drew mockery and skepticism has become a destination for automotive enthusiasts, law enforcement professionals, and families seeking to understand how one man's quiet courage helped restore justice to victims of long unsolved crimes. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who'd been so vocal about the worthlessness of my inheritance, now regularly brings visitors to hear the story of Earl's undercover work and the collection that helped solve decades-old cases. The barn that once concealed a secret workshop now houses a public museum where Earl's restored vehicles are displayed, alongside documentation of their role in the investigation that brought criminals to justice. Guided tours highlight not just the monetary value of the collection, but the patience, expertise, and moral courage required to maintain a double life in service of victims who never knew his name. These visits remind me daily that the most valuable inheritances aren't measured in dollars, but in the opportunities they provide to honor the past while building something meaningful for the future. Standing in the workshop on quiet evenings, with Rusty settled contentedly at my feet and the restored vehicles gleaming under carefully adjusted lighting, I reflect on the unexpected journey that began with skeptical neighbors and a dog's persistent curiosity about a misaligned wall. The inheritance that seemed like a burden has become the defining adventure of my later years, teaching me that family legacies can take forms we never anticipate, and that the people we think we know best sometimes carry secrets that transform our understanding of courage and commitment. Earl's decision to trust me with his life's work wasn't just about preserving valuable assets or continuing an important investigation. It was about passing along the belief that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they choose purpose over comfort and justice over convenience. The workshop that once hid stolen cars now serves as a reminder that hidden treasures aren't always golden, and that the most precious discoveries sometimes reveal themselves only to those patient enough to follow the subtle signs that others overlook. Rusty's instincts led us to uncover more than vintage automobiles and documentation. They guided us toward understanding that legacy means accepting responsibility for causes larger than our individual concerns, and recognizing that the bonds we build with both people and principles outlast any material inheritance. Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew well was actually living a completely different life in service of causes you never suspected? I'd love to hear about the moments when your understanding of family, community, or personal mission suddenly shifted in ways that changed everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you.